I have a student driver currently, and one of the most important things to learn as you're learning to drive is you've got to stay between the lines. Minivans and ditches are bad combinations. So it is with the Christian life. We have a gospel road that we're called to drive down with Jesus, and there are ditches on both sides. One ditch, it's a large ditch, it's easy to run into. It's the ditch called legalism, which simply means that we think by keeping the law, by doing certain activity, we create our identity, that we can earn status with God, if it's a large amount or a small amount, that we contribute somehow to saving ourselves. You've got to stay out of this ditch. It's not the gospel. However, when you avoid this ditch, don't jerk the wheel so hard that you end up in the other ditch on the other side of the road. This one is called antinomianism. It's a rather unfortunate word that simply means no law. That not only are you free and not condemned as a Christian, but the law, obedience, duty, all those things are utterly dirty words. You don't have to think about or worry about anything you do anymore as a Christian. Well, Paul wants to keep you on the gospel road because both legalism and antinomianism are ditches and they will total your Christian experience. So how do we stay on that road? What does it mean to stay between the lines in the right way? Look at Romans 8 with me again. We're going to look very briefly at two verses, verses 13 and 14. When you go through Romans 8, you see that Paul is emphasizing our identity. Jesus has secured and given us an identity, and he's done it by the Spirit. And in verse 13, then, he actually moves a little bit into what activity is generated by our identity, that we actively put to death our sin. We're very engaged and involved in that process. And then in 14, he immediately switches back to a passive stance, that's only true for those who are led by the Spirit, meaning those who are Christians and have the Spirit of God in them. So you see that we're actively engaged, but that in a sense it's sandwiched between the identity that's already been given to us, that we're led by the Spirit, and only because of what God has already done in us can we actively put to death our sin. Now, when we say something like redemption is 100% empowered by God, that justification and sanctification are entirely powered by God, that we are not performing something that saves us, people get nervous. They start to hear that as if we're somehow robots, that our humanity or even our engagement or involvement doesn't matter at all to God. That's not true in any case. Think about this. If I tell you you're dead in your sin, you simply can't save yourself. You can't pick yourself up by your own spiritual efforts. But the good news is Jesus has come in and saved you. How is that exactly a negative thing? And yet the question persists. Yeah, but if Jesus is doing it all, then what am I supposed to do? Does it matter at all how I'm engaged? It is, in that sense, a fair question. As I said Sunday, one of the goals of our salvation is to bring us back into communion with God. And that full humanity actually looks like full communion with God. So when we say an action is performed by the Spirit or entirely empowered by God, not by our own efforts, we're not saying that our human engagement, our human faculties are utterly sidelined. In fact, it's just the opposite. Because we're spiritually dead, when the Spirit comes along and by his work and by his power does something new in us, he gives us life. And for the first time now, we're spiritually alive and we're able to engage the things that God has for us. John Owen said it this way: God does not save us in a way that unmans man. He doesn't make us robots. He doesn't get rid of our faculties or our engagement. In fact, it's just the opposite. Only by God saving us first are we able to engage him at all and begin to pursue this life of delight and joy that he has for us. So as we're actively putting our sin to death, verse 13, it's a restoration of who we're meant to be. It's not getting rid of our humanity at all. John Calvin said that when we deny ourselves, when we move away from our sin, turn away from our selfishness, when we deny ourselves, we're not denying our created selves, meaning who we were designed to be. No, we're denying what the Bible calls our old selves, our sinful selves, our false selves that think we can get by being independent from God. In fact, the only way to be fully human, the only way to experience humanity as it's meant to be, is by the Spirit, to have your communion with God restored so you can actually begin to move towards him instead of staying distanced from him. Another way to say this is that justification and sanctification always go together. Now, the Westminster Confession defines them separately. Justification is a free act of God. Sanctification is a free work of God. They're not the same thing, But they always go together. They come in the same package. If you get one, you get the other. Now, it's only true if God truly does it. It's entirely his work and his power in you. And yet, while being entirely gracious, God has designed it in such a way that it fully engages our hearts and calls us to participate. It calls us into a life of delightful obedience. Let me give you an illustration to finish. I remember 25 years ago or so watching an NBA game, and at halftime, they interviewed Penny Hardaway. He was the best player on his team, many time an all-star, but he'd had a few rough years. And so the team had gone through some changes and had hired a new coach, Chuck Daly. Chuck had coached the Pistons to 2 world championships and had led the '92 Dream Team to Olympic gold. He was highly successful and accomplished. And Penny was a little nervous. He wasn't convinced that he would be approved of by Coach Daly, and so it made him tentative. He wasn't sure. He was trying to prove himself, but it wasn't going very well. And Chuck Daly noticed this and pulled Penny aside. He said, "Penny, listen, you're our guy. You're our guy. We in no way are going to get rid of you. We're not going to cut you. We're not going to trade you. We're not going to bench you. You're our guy. Just play ball." See, he knew that if Penny felt safe and free, he would go play ball. He would do what he was designed to do, what he was made to do. See, as a Christian, Paul is telling us you're safe and free. You're not condemned. You don't have to earn your status anymore. You don't have to keep your job. You don't have to prove anything to God. You're safe and free. And because you're safe and free, you can go play ball. You can do what you're meant to do. You can run into delightful obedience, knowing that you're actively engaged, but it's entirely gracious. That as you participate, it's entirely powered by God and by his Spirit. Cross Park, I hope this was helpful to you today. I hope it encourages you to see the full freedom and joy in the gospel and the delight in running hard for the right reasons after you.